Well, folks, once again, welcome back to my YouTube channel, Captain Boat Builder. I'm down here in my basement boatyard, still working away on the Viola 14. Today's episode is number 13, lucky 13, and we're going to call this one Installing the Deck. As I mentioned in a previous video, today pretty much you're going to see the installation of only two pieces of wood. And I can't tell you how much time it took. But they're installed. They seem to be installed correctly. I'm quite pleased with the result. So you'll see the installation process. You'll see some of the things that I struggled with just a little bit. Some of the preliminary things that I did before I put the deck panels down. And the results. So I hope you enjoy this episode. And the boat is really starting to take shape. So we'll get right to it. Now I've glued in the AFT Link Frame. I think that's what this is called. It's this piece right here near the transom that connects the ends of the flotation tanks, firms them up, firms up their position, and also firms up the back of the boat, the three bottom hull panels. Now you'll notice that I've got this stick in here that's held in place. It's got rubber on both ends, got some tape here so it won't slide. I'm using this as a wedge to slightly, very slightly separate the back of the boat from this point right here over to that point right there. And again, that's the dimension that's supposed to be 517 millimeters. And that's where it's set right now. And I wanted to use the stick as a wedge so that when the link frame, which is now glued in place, solidified and all the resin catalyzed, I'm hoping that it'll hold these two corners of the flotation tanks in exactly the right spacing. I honestly can't remember if I've mentioned this little technique before. I could have, and I just forgot. But it's been saving me so much time and effort and pain in my fingers with the sanding that I wanted to mention it again. And it has to do with sanding and smoothing the seams, mostly between the panels that form the hull. You can see here that this seam, which I've used a mixture of the resin and the wood flour as filleting material, and I've gone over it with a putty knife, but as you can see, it's still pretty rough. This stuff is quite strong. It dries hard as a rock. And so the sanding by hand is, well, it's pretty bad. So I wanted to show you what I found kind of by accident. And like I say, I don't know whether I mentioned this before. This is a random orbital sander. I've got it hooked up to my shop vac, which does a great job of sucking up the dust. But what I found is that you can use this to sand these fillet areas, especially the ones where the angle is quite wide. This doesn't work too well in a 90-degree situation like here on the sides of the flotation tanks, but especially for the hull panels, it works great. And what you can do is you can just gently, see if I can show you how you hold this thing. You can just gently use the edge. Really, all I'm using is this part of the sander right here on the edge. So it's orbital and it's random, moving in a slow circle. So you can take this thing and you can just use the edge of it to just go back and forth, back and forth. It takes a little bit of practice, but you can do this and you can get a nice smooth surface. You see what I've got here, and goes pretty fast. The other thing I've done, and I don't know whether I've shown you this before, I can't remember, is again for these type of fillets on a fairly big angle, I found that if you take sandpaper, this is 80 grit, and you wrap it around a foam roller, it just happens to be almost the right diameter to fit pretty evenly so that you can sand this way, or you can also sand back and forth. And so anyhow, these are just two things that I've been doing lately to sand the super hard filleting material which is, again, it's the mixture of the wood flour and the epoxy resin. It's worked well for me. I hope it helps you out. This is the partner beam and the mast block, partner block. This is the underside. I glued it together and completely painted the underside before I installed this in the boat, and the reason I did this was I just hate painting upside down. Well, at last, the partner beam and the partner block are installed. I'm just waiting for the epoxy to set up. As shown in the instructions, here's the screw. I just used one in the reinforcing plate. And the nice thing is that it's all painted underneath, so that's all finished. The only thing left is just a little touch up here on the edges, on the front and back side. But that's finished. That's the last piece before I connect the deck. As I get ready to glue the deck down, I want to show you something here that took quite a bit of time. I want to show you the match between the curve of the deck planking and this groove where the deck is going to sit. You can see that the curve matches the groove pretty well. And this took quite a bit of time and constant, a little sanding here, a little sanding there, and fitting. And so now I've got it not quite perfect, but almost. So you can see there's a really small gap in here that's going to be filled in with the mixture of the epoxy and the wood flour. So that took quite a bit of time, but it fits really nicely the whole length. I'm going to get a nice smooth bond, and we're going to have a nice transition from the deck to the little piece of the hull to the gunnel. It's all going to be nice and smooth. One little check I did for the uniformity of the curve. As you can see here, these are the panels for the decking. And one's right side up, one's upside down, but they're on top of each other. And you can see that I've set them back just a little bit. They're staggered just a little bit so that you can clearly see what's going on here. And I wanted to show you, this is the uniformity of the curve. And this is the curve for the top piece and the curve for the bottom piece. And so now you can see that the panels are quite uniform, and it's just an indication of how the curve went on the side of the boat. This is the way that I pre-coated the underside of the deck. This piece is actually for the starboard side, and it's going to be flipped over and it's going to go on the other side. But I just wanted to show you that I pre-coated this part with paint, and this is going to be on here, so that now when this is all glued together, this underside here will be pre-painted. Again, I hate painting upside down. So when I get ready to glue the deck on, what I'll be doing is all of this raw wood that you see is going to get one coat of epoxy that's going to be allowed to penetrate maybe for a half an hour, maybe even a little bit longer. And I'm also going to use the epoxy in advance on the edge of the in-wheel, or the deck cleat as they would call it, and all of these surfaces where there's going to be a bond. Everything you see that's raw wood, that's going to be saturated with epoxy before I use the mixture of wood flour and epoxy to glue it down to fill in all the gaps. So I'm just about to glue these panels down, and man, it's taken a long time. I'm finally getting ready to glue the deck down, and I just wanted to do one last check to make sure that everything is exactly the way I want it before I start putting down the epoxy, because after that I can't do a thing. So I wanted to show you here, I'm using the Camber template to check. And what you get is you get a nice smooth curve, like a very, very shallow arc from one side to the other. And I'm checking it at different stations. You can see how it works here, and you can see that it's just about right there. And there's another check. And there's the last check down toward the transom. So it looks great. Well, it looks great except for one thing. And this is, again, where I'm trying to fess up to my own mistakes. So I just wanted you to see what I've discovered in spite of the endless measurement that I did. You can see here that the only reason that I've got the correct camber on the deck is because it's shimmed up. You can see the spaces. It's shimmed up with, of all things, tongue depressors that I slid in the space and positioned them just right so that the camber would be correct. But what I realized is even after all my careful measurements, I cut down the top edge of the planking for the flotation tank. I cut it too low. And I've got to tell you, I measured and sighted this so many times I can't remember, and I still didn't get it right. But now, with the deck shimmed up on top of this side panel for the flotation tanks, I now have the correct camber and it's nice and even. But it was clearly a mistake on my part, and I cut the tops of the side tanks down too far, and all the checking that I did with the camber gauge, I was doing something incorrectly. But now I've got it the way I want it, and that space that you see, that will be filled with a mixture of epoxy and wood flour, and that'll produce an extremely strong joint. I'll be able to smooth it out, and it's going to look just fine. But there's a big mistake. Strangely, that's on the starboard side. Strangely, on the port side is almost correct without any shimming, which I don't understand. Now I have both sides of the decking glued down. The starboard side here is glued, and it's set up. You'll notice I have some small holes here, unfortunately, that I'm going to have to fill. That I use I use small screws just to secure it, make sure I got a nice tight fit. I did one side completely, let the glue set up, and then I'm just doing the other side today. And the reason I did that is because with one side secured, it's much easier to match this seam right here in the middle with the other side. So I've been able to get a good match. And after this, I'm going to be filling in the area right here between the deck and the side of the flotation tanks. I'm going to be filling that in. I'm going to be fairing it down. And then I'm going to be starting to coat it with epoxy. And I'm thinking that originally I was going to paint the deck. But the wood grain is so nice, now I'm starting to think that maybe I'll just do it natural. And I have to put 3 coats of epoxy on it anyway, so I'll have a really good idea of what it's going to look like when it's natural finish. Just as a reminder, remember I mentioned that I did secure some of these pieces with small screws, like this one right here. Tried not to screw it in too tight to mash the wood down. But remember, when you use those screws and there's epoxy in the area, after about 5 or 6 hours after the epoxy is partially set up most of the way, you need to take those screws out, because if you don't, you're going to have to cut them and grind them out. And unfortunately, I did forget some one night, and I was cutting and grinding the next day. So don't forget to take the screws out. And I'll be back with you after I get some epoxy on here, and then you can see what the natural deck's going to look like. Just another quick shot here. Wanted to show you what I'm doing again to check for uniformity and for the correct angle for the deck. You may notice here I've got the mahogany cross pieces on just as a reference, and you can see how the edges here are raised, goes across, and you can see the space here. Well, that's because of the angle and the curve of the deck. And you can see it's pretty much the same at each piece, but what I really was trying to do is, again, I'm trying to look down the center line, and I'm trying to look at these pieces. I'm trying to see if they all are as close to parallel as possible, which would indicate that the curve and everything is pretty much lined up. What I have noticed here, unfortunately, I think you'll be able to see this, is when I look very closely in sight, what I can see, excuse me, is at the top of my transom is actually slightly crooked. And so I'm trying to decide whether, oh, sandpaper dust in my throat. I'm trying to decide whether I want to spend the time to sort of sand down the left side, the port side of the little transom top to make it closer to parallel, or whether it's such a small difference that I'm just going to leave it alone. I haven't quite decided. But I was quite happy to see using these mahogany cross pieces to see how closely they line up in parallel and how the boat is pretty straight. So here at last we have the finished product. And as I said before, when I was putting the sides on the flotation tanks, this was just 2 pieces of wood. And once again, all this work for essentially 2 pieces of wood, the 2 pieces of deck planking. The finish that you're looking at now is 3 layers of epoxy that have been sanded. And because I'm sanding it, I'm not quite sure how much epoxy is actually on it. I will put on at least 1 more coat of epoxy with more sanding to get as smooth a finish as possible. What I found is that in the end, especially on flat surfaces like the decking here, the answer is varnish, because the varnish lays out perfectly flat and it looks like glass. The epoxy doesn't seem to lay out quite as flat. I'm also trying to decide whether or not the deck's going to be painted. I would have had to put the epoxy down anyway. I kind of like the look. As I close out this episode, there's just a few things remaining, and they will actually be in the next episode. The deck hangs over the side of the flotation tank, as you can see. It's just a little bit too big. I haven't trimmed it yet, and this I'm hoping to be able to do this with a router, and so the deck here will be flush with the side of the flotation tank. Then on top of that, I'll be putting this piece of wood. I have to bend it in place. And this is actually what they call a finger grip, and it goes right on the edge here. And the reason is that if you capsize and you reach over and you're trying to get back in the boat, you want to have something to grip onto. So I'll be putting these finger grips on. I'll be using the router to smooth out the edge, and that'll pretty much complete the deck. I have to do a little bit of trimming up here, right in this corner. There's a little bit of overhang, and I have to figure out how to connect the finger grip in here and make it look nice and uniform. So that'll be on future episodes. But the deck is pretty much finished except for these last 2 stages, which I will document later. And from here, I'm going to move on to more painting, and I'll be starting to build the centerboard, excuse me, the daggerboard case. And it's a small part of the boat, but it's important that you get it right. It has to be straight, and it has to be lined up perfectly with the center line. So that's pretty much it for this episode. I'm thrilled that the deck is finished. The result is pretty much what I hoped for, and I'm quite happy with it. So once again, thanks for watching. If you feel like sending me a comment or a question, that would be great, and I hope you've enjoyed the episode. So for now, so long.